Today I'm happy to introduce Larry Kirshner. Larry has spoken in our series before in other years, and it's kind of fun to introduce him because I could describe him a number of different ways. He is a friend, a poet, a historian, an ethicist. He's a veteran. He wears a number of different hats. I'm wearing my hat today too. Larry is going to talk on the subject of supporting the troops. It's a phrase we hear a lot, and we're sometimes not sure exactly what people mean by it, or they mean different things by it. And then after the colon, we put an ethical inquiry, because this issue of how to support our loved ones, how to keep them out of harm's way, all of the different ethical issues that surround the questions of war and human community can be at least spoken about in community, especially at a college like this, in a way that will shed light on the subject and make us all consider the implications of the things we do. So I'd like to welcome Larry Kirshner.
Thanks, Don. Thanks for coming. Today I basically want to look at what do we mean when we use the phrase support the troops. It means a lot of different things to different people. I've given some thought to this and I'll share some of my ideas. Mostly I think I'm going to leave you with some questions so that you can consider it in your own life, what it means to you. And hopefully we'll have time to have some kind of an interchange, some discussion about the issue. Almost 6 years ago, a group of activists here in Lewis County started a weekly vigil near the Centralia library. And our hope was to help create a political atmosphere in which it would be unlikely that President Bush would invade Iraq. Needless to say, we didn't accomplish that, but there actually was a surprising amount of support for that position here in Lewis County, despite the fact that it's so politically conservative. Some Saturdays we had as many as 50 people there to vigil near the library. But in March of 2003, once we invaded Iraq, the number of people who came to our vigil dwindled to the 5 to 10 range from the up to 50. And the most common reason that the folks who stopped coming gave was that now that we're at war, we have to support the troops. Even though they disagreed with the war and the invasion, they felt that they couldn't publicly do anything that would cause them to be perceived as not supporting the troops. So, what does support the troops mean? What do we mean when we say we support the troops? Where did the idea that we owe such slavish devotion to what the country says we need to do come from? And why would we support something that we don't agree with just because the government calls on us to do it? Well, in part, we can blame the Greek philosopher Plato. Plato tells the story of his mentor Socrates and why Socrates committed suicide drinking the hemlock. The main crime that Socrates committed was teaching the young people to ask the question, why? And when they got that answer, to ask why again. That essentially is the Socratic Method. Those in power in Greece at the time didn't find this very amusing. They told Socrates that he had to kill himself. Now, Plato, in his discourse on this, has a friend of Socrates named Crito say, in essence, that's pretty stupid. Why don't you just pack up your bags and get out of Dodge? But 2,000 years ago, more than 2,000 years ago, Plato had Socrates say, quote, "In war and in the court of justice and everywhere, you must do whatever your state and your country tell you to do, or you must persuade them that their commands are unjust," unquote. Thus, the state can use force to gain its aims, but the citizen is limited to the using words. The idea that the state is to the citizen as a master is to the slave has come down to us in many different forms and fashions. And one of those forms is that we must always support the troops. Despite how you color it, obedience to the state is a basic tenet of any totalitarian system. The Bush and previous administrations would have us believe that support the troops means to support anything that our troops do to further the plans that the government says is necessary. The trials at Nuremberg after the Second World War, however, established the fact that there are situations that occur in war that are criminal. The Germans and the Japanese were not charged as war criminals for actions that the US and Great Britain and the other allies had done at the time, such as firebombing a whole city of civilians like Dresden or Tokyo. What the Germans and the Japanese were charged with as war crimes were things that they had done that the Allies hadn't done at that time. Various things. I'll get to some of them. Okay. The German High Commissioner of occupied Holland was named Seyss-Inquart, and he was sentenced to death at Nuremberg for the war crime of breaching the dikes in Holland, which indirectly led to the death of many Dutch. To prevent the Anglo-American army from crossing Holland, the Germans flooded a 500,000 acres of farmland. And this caused a precipitous decline in the food that was available to the Dutch. There were 185 Nazis who were indicted at Nuremberg. Only 24 of them were put to death. One of the 24 was Seyss-Inquart. So it shows that the crime of breaching a dam and causing a precipitous decline in food available to the population was considered a pretty serious crime. However, just a couple of years later, in 1950, the United States Air Force destroyed the Toksan Dam and 4 other dams in North Korea, and they intentionally destroyed the system that irrigated 75% of the farmland in North Korea. And that was just after the spring planting season, doing the same thing that the Germans just a few years before had been accused of as a war crime. And in fact, some of them had died for doing the same thing. As the dams were wiped out, it scoured out 5 square miles of farmland. Hundreds of people died in the flooding. Hundreds of buildings and bridges were taken out. According to the U.S. Air Force Directorate of Operations, during the 5 days of attack, quote, "The damage done by the deluge far exceeded the hopes of everyone," unquote. And according to the Air University Quarterly Review, quote, "To the communists, the smashing of the dams meant primarily the destruction of their chief sustenance, rice. The Westerner can little conceive the awesome meaning which the loss of this stable food commodity has for the Asian: starvation and slow death. Rice famine, for centuries the chronic scourge of the Orient, is more feared than the deadliest plague. Hence, the show of rage, the flare of violent tempers, and the avowed threats of reprisals when the bombs fell on 5 irrigation dams, unquote. Now, notwithstanding the underlying racism of that statement, they essentially were bragging about committing a war crime. In the summer of 1950, American forces opened fire and killed hundreds of South Korean villagers near a village called Nogunri in 3 days of slaughter. Commissioner Kudo Chung of the Korean National Commission on the Nogunri incident told me that after the armistice were signed, there were at least 23 other similar incidents reported. From early November 1950 onwards, U.S. General MacArthur ordered that a wasteland be created between the front and the Chinese border, destroying from the air, quote, every installation, factory, city, and village, unquote, over thousands of miles of North Korean territory. In November of 1950, B-29 bombers dropped 550 tons of incendiary bombs on a small village called Sanuji in North Korea. And the official statement is quoted as saying, removing it from the map. According to U.S. Air Force General Curtis LeMay, quote, over a period of 3 years or so, we burned down every town in North Korea and South Korea too, unquote. In 1968, U.S. troops massacred between 350 and 500 men, women, and children in the Vietnamese village of My Lai. Before being killed, some of the victims were raped, sexually molested, beaten, tortured, or maimed. Dead bodies were mutilated. The Los Angeles Times in August 6th of 2006 reported finding that U.S. troops committed at least 320 similar incidents during the Vietnam War, or as the Vietnamese call it, the American War. In 1969, Billy Graham wrote a letter to Richard Nixon after meeting in Bangkok with Christian missionaries from Vietnam. These men of God took on the mantle of war criminals when they urged Nixon to bomb the dikes of North Vietnam if the Paris peace talks failed. Graham urged this action because it, quote, could overnight destroy the economy of North Vietnam, unquote. There was no mention made of the bodies or the souls of the Vietnamese who were killed. So, do we support the troops because God, in the form of Billy Graham or Cardinal Cushing or Pat Robertson, is on our side? Do we support the troops when they publicly and proudly admit war crimes, as in the bombing of North Korea? Do we support the troops when they secretly massacre civilians, as in Vietnam and Korea? Do we support the troops when they invade and occupy a little non-threatening island country like Grenada? Do we support the troops when, under orders from the elder President Bush, they invaded Panama and killed 3,000 civilians in the supposed process of arresting Manuel Noriega, the same Noriega who was a CIA agent and had met with Elder Bush in the White House several years before? Do we support the troops when they call the Japanese nips? Do we support the troops when they call the Vietnamese gooks and dinks? Do we support the troops when they call the Iraqi citizens hajis, ragheads, sand niggers? One of the prime war crimes for which the Nazis were hung was the act of invading a sovereign country, such as Poland or Czechoslovakia, which was no threat to them. The United Nations Charter establishes the basic principle of international law that no country has the right to send its troops into another country without that country's permission, except in clear self-defense. The official premise of the first Gulf War in 1991 was to punish Saddam Hussein for having invaded Kuwait. Iraq did not attack and occupy the United States. Afghanistan did not attack and occupy the United States. Do we support the troops when they invade and occupy a country that is no threat to us? Are we supporting the troops when we put them in a situation where they have to kill people who are just defending their homes from a foreign invader? Do we recognize the right of the Iraqis and the Afghanis to support their own troops, even if they are irregular militias? Can we support the troops when they drop bombs from 40,000 feet and unseeing kill thousands of civilians below, as in Afghanistan and Korea and Vietnam? Should we support the troops if we don't believe in this or any war? Do we support the troops when we pay our taxes? Are we supporting the troops when there's a significant lack of mental and physical health care available to them when they return from war? According to the Army Times, 336,000 veterans, including 1,500 Afghani and Iraq veterans, were homeless for part or all of 2006. Recent anti-war activists have pretty well united using the slogan, "Support the troops." Now, why would groups and individuals who are adamantly opposed to war be willing to provide aid and comfort to those who, by taking part in an unjust and illegal war, are committing mass murder on the people of another country? Patriotic liberal forces in the anti-war movement suggest that we can unite everyone by reason and discussion of common concerns. They've convinced themselves that by saying support the troops, they can show their concern for the welfare of the youth of this country. Unfortunately, the media and the militarist forces in our country have no intention of having a reasoned discussion. The official support the troops movement has nothing to do with supporting the troops. If these folks supported the troops, they would not call someone like Lieutenant Aaron Watada a traitor for opposing this illegal war in Iraq. If they supported the troops, they would applaud someone who takes seriously the words of the enlistment oath. Every person joining the military, including myself, swears to protect and defend the U.S. Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Do we support the troops who've changed their minds about being in the military and desert their posts? According to the U.S. Army, there's been creating an economic condition in our country. For their reporting, the VA claimed that there was less than 800 attempted suicides each year publicly of veterans, whereas their internal emails show that they count somewhere in the neighborhood of 12,000 attempted suicides of veterans each year. Seeing street demonstrations and civil disobedience. We've come nowhere near having the number of people in the streets as were in the streets in the 60s and 70s. had I known what I know now, I wouldn't have allowed myself to be drafted.